The hands came from behind without warning. Rough, impatient, designed to move obstacles rather than people. "Come on, old man, you need to move. VIPs coming through." The security guard's voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, his grip tightening on the elderly man's arm as he began steering him away from the rope line. The veteran didn't resist. At 81 years old, with arthritis in both knees and a back that protested every sudden movement, he simply allowed himself to be guided toward the crowd of lesser spectators. His weathered hands clutched a small American flag, the kind handed out at parades and forgotten in kitchen drawers. He'd been standing there for 2 hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ceremony honoring the newest class of Navy SEALs. Around him, the crowd pressed closer to the rope barriers as black SUVs approached the naval base entrance. Politicians, admirals, defense contractors, and their entourages prepared to witness the graduation of America's most elite warriors. The old man was just another face in the crowd, another retiree with time to kill and stories nobody wanted to hear. Phase work continue. That's sometimes the most important person in the but what the security guard couldn't see, what the pushing crowd couldn't know, was that the frail old man being shoved aside had shaped more Navy SEALs than anyone else in the program's history. That his quiet presence at the ceremony wasn't casual interest, but a master craftsman watching his lyrium is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. Standing just 20 feet away, adjusting his dress whites for the ceremony, a young petty officer first class was watching the entire scene unfold with growing anger. And he was about to do something that would stop the ceremony, embarrass the VIPs, and remind everyone present what real respect looked like. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue with this incredible moment that transformed a military ceremony into something no one expected, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this community. Naval Base Coronado stretched along the Pacific coastline like a fortress of American sea power, its pristine buildings and manicured grounds reflecting decades of military precision. The ceremony platform had been constructed specifically for this event, overlooking the training grounds where the Navy's most elite warriors earned their tridents through months of punishment that would break ordinary men. SEAL graduation ceremonies were rare public events, usually restricted to families and high-ranking officials. But this particular class was special, the largest graduating group in 5 years, representing the military's response to increasing global threats. The ceremony had drawn attention from Washington, from defense contractors eager to showcase their equipment, from politicians wanting to be photographed with America's heroes. The morning air carried the salt scent of the ocean mixed with the crisp formality of a military inspection. Hundreds of folding chairs arranged in perfect rows faced a stage where admirals would speak, medals would be presented, and the newest SEALs would receive their tridents in front of families who'd spent months wondering if their sons would survive the training. Behind the VIP section, separated by rope barriers and security personnel, several hundred spectators had gathered. Military families, local supporters, retired veterans, and curious civilians drawn by the chance to witness something extraordinary. Most had arrived hours early, claiming spots along the barriers where they might catch a glimpse of the ceremony or hear the speeches through the sound system. Among them stood Command Master Chief William "Bill" Garrett, though nobody in the crowd knew his name or rank. To them, he was just another elderly veteran wearing a faded Navy ball cap and carrying a small flag. His civilian clothes were clean but unremarkable. His bearing, though still straight, lacked the crisp authority that had once commanded instant respect. At 81, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a retiree with too much time and an interest in military ceremonies. But appearances, as every SEAL learns, can be deceiving. Bill Garrett had spent 38 years in the Navy, the last 22 as the senior enlisted instructor for SEAL training. He'd been there when the program was redesigned in the 1980s, when standards were raised and methods refined. He'd personally overseen the training of more than 4,000 SEALs, including many who now held senior positions throughout the special operations community. His retirement ceremony in 2003 had been attended by admirals, generals, and operators from every special forces unit in the military. His influence on modern special warfare doctrine was immeasurable. His legacy lived in every SEAL who'd learned discipline, precision, and mental toughness under his unforgiving tutelage. But that was 20 years ago. Memory fades. Personnel rotate. New generations of leaders emerge who never served under the old masters. And gradually, inevitably, the giants who built the foundations of elite military units become invisible to the institutions they created. Bill had driven 3 hours from his assisted living facility in San Diego to attend the ceremony. Not because he was invited. He hadn't been. Not because he expected recognition. He didn't. But because watching young men earn their tridents remained the greatest joy of his life, even if nobody remembered that he'd helped design the very standards they were meeting. He'd arrived at dawn, claimed a spot near the rope barrier, and waited patiently as the crowd grew around him. Occasionally, someone would recognize his Navy cap and strike up a conversation about their own service or their son's deployment. But mostly, he stood quietly, watching the preparations and remembering thousands of similar moments when he'd been on the other side of the ceremony, pinning tridents on chests and shaking hands with young warriors ready to serve their country. The VIP section began filling an hour before the ceremony. Admirals in dress whites, their chests heavy with ribbons. Congressional representatives practicing their handshakes and camera angles. Defense officials discussing contracts and capabilities. All of them important, influential, essential to the military-industrial complex that kept America's Special Operations Forces equipped and funded. As the ceremony's start time approached, security became more aggressive about maintaining clear pathways for the dignitaries. Bill had noticed the guards becoming more insistent about keeping spectators behind the barriers, more willing to use physical force to maintain order. But he'd served long enough to understand that ceremonies were about appearances as much as substance, that someone had to play the role of the unimportant masses being managed by the important few. When the black SUVs began arriving, the crowd pressed forward instinctively, hoping for better views or photographs. Security guards moved among the spectators like shepherds managing livestock, pushing people back, creating space, maintaining the invisible but absolute boundary between the VIPs and everyone else. That's when the hands grabbed Bill's arms. "Come on, old man, you need to move. VIPs coming through." The security guard was young, probably military police or contracted security, with the kind of casual authority that came from months of moving civilians around like furniture. His grip was firm without being brutal, professional without being respectful. Bill didn't argue. At his age, with his knees and back, physical confrontation wasn't an option. He allowed himself to be guided away from the rope line, back into the crowd of lesser spectators, understanding that this was simply how things worked now. The ceremony would continue without him, just as the military would continue long after he was gone. But as the security guards steered him away from the barrier, their movement caught the attention of someone who recognized what was happening from an entirely different perspective. Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison was 26 years old, 6 years into his Navy career, and 3 months away from trying out for SEAL training himself. He'd spent those 3 months studying everything he could about the program, reading every manual, interviewing every SEAL he could find, preparing mentally and physically for the most demanding military training in the world. Part of that preparation had involved researching the history of SEAL training, learning about the instructors and leaders who'd shaped the program over the decades. And one name had appeared more frequently than any other in the accounts of successful SEALs from the 1980s and 1990s, Command Master Chief William Garrett. Every article about SEAL training evolution mentioned him. Every memoir by successful operators included stories about his influence. Every historical account of special warfare development credited him with innovations that had become standard practice. Jake had seen dozens of photographs of the legendary instructor, though most were from 20 or 30 years ago when Garrett had been in his prime. But Jake Morrison had an eye for faces and bearing that comes from military training, and as he watched the security guard manhandle the elderly veteran away from the rope line, something clicked. The posture, even diminished by age. The way the old man moved, even while being pushed. The calm acceptance of disrespect that suggested someone accustomed to being more important than he appeared. Jake looked closer at the old man's face, comparing it to the mental file of photographs he'd studied. Older, certainly, weathered by 20 years of retirement, but unmistakably the same person. Command Master Chief William Garrett, the man who'd trained more SEALs than anyone in history, being pushed around by security like a homeless person wandering into the wrong event. That's when Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out of formation, his dress whites crisp and perfect, his bearing radiating the kind of military precision that makes civilians step aside without thinking. The security guard was still guiding Bill away from the rope line when Jake's voice cut through the ambient noise like a sword. Command Master Chief on deck. The words carried across the ceremony grounds with the force of absolute authority. Every military person within hearing distance responded instantly, instinctively, without thought. Marines snapped to attention. Sailors straightened their postures. Even some of the VIP section turned to see what was happening. The security guard froze, his hands still on Bill's arms, suddenly aware that he'd become the center of attention in a way that felt dangerous and wrong. Around him, dozens of military personnel had stopped what they were doing to render proper honors to someone they couldn't see, but whose rank had just been announced. Jake Morrison approached at the quick march, his eyes fixed on Bill Garrett with the kind of respect usually reserved for flag officers. When he reached the position where the security guard was still holding the elderly veteran, Jake came to a perfect halt and rendered the sharpest salute of his military career. "Command Master Chief Garrett, sir," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent section of the ceremony grounds. "Petty Officer First Class Morrison requests permission to escort you to your proper position." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Bill Garrett looked at the young sailor standing before him, recognition dawning slowly as he processed what was happening. The security guard looked between them, suddenly understanding that he'd made a serious mistake, but not yet comprehending how serious. And throughout the ceremony grounds, military personnel who'd heard the announcement were beginning to whisper among themselves as the name, Garrett, triggered memories and connections they'd thought were ancient history. "Son," Bill said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command, "I think there's been some confusion. I'm just here to watch the ceremony." "No confusion, Master Chief," Jake replied, maintaining his salute. "You're William Garrett, senior enlisted instructor for SEAL training from 1981 to 2003. You personally trained more Navy SEALs than anyone in the program's history. You developed the psychological evaluation protocols still used today. You wrote the handbook on advanced combat swimming that's still required reading for every SEAL candidate." Jake's voice carried clearly across the grounds, and with each detail, more heads turned. In the VIP section, several admirals were now paying attention, their conversations forgotten as they heard a name that carried significant weight in their community. "Sir," Jake continued, "this man trained 3 generations of SEALs. He outranks everyone at this ceremony except God and the flag. And that security guard just manhandled him like he was a vagrant." The last sentence carried enough quiet fury to make the security guard release Bill's arms and step back instinctively. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand the details. From the VIP section, movement began as several senior officers rose from their seats. Admiral Patricia Collins, the ceremony's senior officer, was walking toward the commotion with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command authority. Behind her, 2 other flag officers followed, their expressions suggesting that someone was about to receive career-ending guidance. But before the admirals could reach them, something else happened that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. From throughout the ceremony grounds, SEALs began emerging from their positions. Active duty operators who were providing security, recently graduated SEALs who were attending as honored guests, instructor staff who were participating in the ceremony. One by one, they approached the position where Jake Morrison was still saluting Command Master Chief Garrett. The first to arrive was a grizzled senior chief with 22 years of service and 4 combat deployments. He took position beside Jake and rendered his own salute. "Master Chief Garrett trained me in 1995, sir. Bud/S, Class 201. A lieutenant commander joined them. "Class 187, sir. You failed me twice before I finally made it through. Best thing that ever happened to my career." Within minutes, more than 30 SEALs had formed an impromptu honor guard around the elderly veteran, each rendering crisp salutes, while sharing their class numbers and years of training. The ceremony itself had effectively stopped as attention focused on the unprecedented display of respect unfolding near the rope barriers. Bill Garrett stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he returned salutes and shook hands with warriors he'd helped create but hadn't seen in decades. Some he remembered clearly. Others had changed too much for recognition. But all of them carried something he'd given them during the hardest months of their lives. Admiral Collins reached the group and immediately understood what was happening. She'd heard stories about Master Chief Garrett throughout her career, had read his training innovations in Staff College, had benefited from standards he'd established even though they'd never served together. But like most senior officers, she'd assumed he was either dead or completely out of touch with the modern military. Master Chief Garrett, she said, approaching with the respect due to a legend, Admiral Collins, commanding officer, Naval Special Warfare Command. Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you. Bill returned her greeting with the dignity he'd maintained throughout his career, but his voice carried slight bewilderment. Admiral, I appreciate the courtesy, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'm just here to watch the ceremony. No, sir, Admiral Collins replied firmly. You're here to be honored by it. And anyone who laid hands on you without permission is about to learn what career-limiting move actually means. She turned to address the security guard, who was now standing alone and looking like he wanted to disappear into the ground. What's your name and organization? Before he could answer, Jake Morrison spoke up. Admiral, with respect, the guard was just doing his job as he understood it. The real problem is that we've allowed the man who built this program to become invisible to the people who benefit from his work. Admiral Collins nodded slowly, understanding the deeper issue. You're right, petty officer. And we're going to fix that right now. What happened next would be talked about for years in SEAL training classes and leadership seminars throughout the military. Admiral Collins personally escorted Bill Garrett to the VIP section, seating him in the front row next to the podium. She delayed the ceremony by 20 minutes while word spread through the ranks about who was present and why his attendance mattered. When the ceremony finally began, Admiral Collins opened with remarks that weren't in her prepared speech. She spoke about foundations and builders, about the debt current SEALs owed to the instructors who'd shaped the program when special warfare was still evolving. She introduced Command Master Chief Garrett to the audience, explaining his role in developing the training that had produced the warriors being honored that day. The applause lasted nearly 5 minutes as the entire assembly, VIPs, military personnel, and civilian spectators, stood to honor a man most of them had never heard of, but who'd influenced everything they were celebrating. During the ceremony, as newly graduated SEALs received their tridents, each one was directed to shake hands with Master Chief Garrett before returning to formation. For many, it was the first time they'd met the man whose standards they'd spent months trying to meet. For Bill, it was a reminder that his life's work continued in ways he'd never imagined. Jake Morrison was recognized during the ceremony as well, receiving a commendation for demonstrating the kind of leadership and respect for tradition that exemplified Navy values. But more importantly, he was accepted into the next SEAL training class, his actions having demonstrated the character and judgment the program sought in its candidates. After the ceremony, as families and dignitaries mingled during the reception, Bill found himself surrounded by people who wanted to hear his stories, learn from his experience, and express gratitude for contributions they'd previously taken for granted. For the first time in years, he felt like more than just an old man with memories. The security guard who'd pushed him aside was reassigned to duties that didn't involve public contact, but not before Admiral Collins personally explained to him why his actions had been problematic. More importantly, the incident led to changes in how security personnel were briefed about military ceremonies, emphasizing respect for all veterans regardless of their apparent status. Jake Morrison would successfully complete SEAL training 18 months later, carrying with him lessons learned not just from BUD/S, but from a moment when he chose to stand up for someone who deserved better. His actions that day became part of SEAL training lore, an example of how recognizing and respecting those who came before you was as important as any tactical skill. But the real transformation was in Bill Garrett himself. The ceremony had reminded him that retirement didn't mean irrelevance, that his contributions continued to matter, that the brotherhood he'd helped build was real and enduring. He began accepting invitations to speak at training graduations, sharing stories and wisdom with new generations of warriors. More importantly, the incident sparked broader recognition of aging veterans whose contributions had been forgotten by the institutions they'd served. Programs were established to maintain connections between retired legends and active duty personnel, ensuring that knowledge and experience weren't lost when people hung up their uniforms. The young SEAL who'd stepped forward that day didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who'd recognized disrespect and chosen to correct it. The elderly veteran who'd been pushed aside didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as part of something larger, something that transcended time and rank and the casual indifference of security guards who didn't know any better. And the ceremony itself became something more than a routine graduation. It became a reminder that respect isn't just about rank or position or current authority. It's about recognizing the people who built the foundations we stand on, who created the standards we try to meet, who sacrificed years of their lives to ensure that others could serve with excellence. Sometimes respect comes from the top down, from orders and regulations and official recognition. But sometimes it comes from the bottom up, from one person who sees injustice and decides to do something about it. From someone young enough to act and wise enough to understand that honoring those who came before you isn't just courtesy, it's responsibility. The security guard who pushed aside an elderly veteran made an honest mistake based on incomplete information. But the young SEAL who corrected that mistake did more than protect one old man's dignity. He demonstrated that the values taught in military training, respect, honor, service before self, weren't just words to be memorized and forgotten. They were principles to be lived, even when it's inconvenient, even when it interrupts ceremonies, even when it requires standing up to authority and insisting that some things are more important than crowd control and VIP protocols. Because sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. And sometimes it takes one person with courage and clarity to remind everyone else what real leadership looks like. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe a teacher who changed lives without seeking credit, a mentor who built others up while staying in the background, or a veteran whose service created opportunities for others. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their example shaped your understanding of true leadership. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.